Last October, I decided to take a solo camping trip to the Chattahoochee National Forest. I'd been camping there dozens of times before with friends and family, but this was my first time going alone. I'd recently gotten divorced and needed some time to clear my head. The forest was especially beautiful that time of year, with the leaves just starting to change colors. I picked a spot about 3 miles off one of the less popular trails in an area I'd camped at twice before. It was a nice flat clearing surrounded by tall pines, with plenty of space for my tent and far enough from other campsites that I'd have complete privacy. I arrived around 4 p.m. and set up my campsite. Just a basic setup with my 2-person tent, a camping chair, and a small fire ring I made with stones. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a light breeze rustling through the trees. I gathered some firewood and got everything organized before darkness set in. As the sun started to set, I got a fire going and heated up some freeze-dried beef stew. The silence was exactly what I needed after months of stress and arguing. Just me, the crackling fire, and the occasional hoot of an owl. While gathering more firewood before it got dark, I noticed something odd about the ground near the edge of my campsite. There was a slight rectangular depression in the earth, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, partially hidden under pine needles. At first, I thought it might be an old fire pit someone had filled in, but when I brushed away some of the needles, I saw what looked like a metal edge poking through the dirt. My curiosity got the better of me, and I used a stick to clear away more of the debris. It was definitely some kind of metal panel or hatch, heavily rusted but clearly manufactured. After clearing away most of the covering, I found what appeared to be hinges on one side. The hatch was heavy, but with some effort, I managed to lift it. The metal groaned as it opened, revealing a dark hole with what looked like old metal rungs leading down into the darkness. The air that wafted up was stale and damp, carrying an unpleasant, musty odor. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to peer down. The shaft descended about 15 feet before appearing to open into a larger space. My rational mind said to close the hatch and forget about it. It was probably some old maintenance tunnel or mining shaft. But something about it felt wrong. This area wasn't known for mining, and the Forest Service had never mentioned any underground infrastructure. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my headlamp from my backpack and began carefully climbing down the rusty rungs. They seemed sturdy enough, though they creaked under my weight. At the bottom, I found myself in what appeared to be a man-made tunnel. The walls and ceiling were reinforced with old metal support beams, and I could see electrical conduit running along the walls, though it was clearly long abandoned. The tunnel extended in both directions, disappearing into darkness. The air was thick and humid, and I could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. I decided to explore in the direction that seemed to slope slightly upward. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a small room, roughly 10 by 12 feet. What I found inside made my blood run cold. There were metal shelving units along the walls, stocked with old canned food and camping supplies, some of which looked relatively new. Rusty tools were scattered on the floor, and a moldy sleeping bag was rolled up in one corner. Someone had been living down here. But what really disturbed me were the Polaroid photos pinned to one wall. They showed various campsites from above, people setting up tents, cooking at their fires, sleeping, all taken from somewhere up in the trees, all without the subject's knowledge. Further down the tunnel, I found an intersection where it split into 3 directions. Each passage had more electrical conduit and support beams, suggesting this was part of a larger network. On the wall was an old junction box with faded labels that I couldn't make out. As I stood there deciding which way to go, I heard something that made my heart stop. The sound of movement coming from one of the tunnels. It wasn't the scurrying of a small animal. These were deliberate, scraping sounds, like someone trying to move quietly. I quickly switched off my headlamp and pressed myself against the wall, trying to control my breathing. The sounds grew closer. In the pitch darkness, I could hear whoever it was breathing, ragged, wheezing breaths that echoed off the tunnel walls. They were moving slowly, methodically, like they knew exactly where they were going despite the darkness. I stayed absolutely still, praying they would take a different tunnel. Instead, the breathing and footsteps grew louder, heading directly toward me. My nerve broke. I turned on my headlamp and ran back the way I'd come, no longer caring about the noise I was making. Behind me, I heard an inhuman shriek and the sound of running footsteps. I reached the shaft and scrambled up the rungs so fast I'm surprised I didn't fall. I slammed the hatch shut and dragged nearby fallen branches over it. Back at my campsite, I quickly doused my fire and grabbed only my essential gear: wallet, keys, phone, and flashlight. I left everything else behind and practically ran the 3 miles back to my car. The next morning, I returned with 2 forest rangers and a local police officer. We found my campsite ransacked. My tent had been slashed open and my remaining gear was scattered everywhere. The hatch was still covered with the branches I dragged over it, but when we opened it, we found the shaft had been partially filled with dirt and rocks. It took specialized equipment and several days for them to clear it out. When they finally accessed the tunnel system, they found evidence of long-term habitation: food wrappers, makeshift furniture, more photographs of unsuspecting campers. But whoever had been living down there was long gone. The investigation revealed that the tunnels were part of an abandoned Cold War-era communications system, built in the 1950s and decommissioned in the late 1960s. They stretched for miles under the forest, connecting various monitoring stations that had long since been demolished above ground. The rangers said they'd had reports over the years of strange noises and missing camping gear, but nothing concrete enough to warrant a full investigation. They've since sealed all the access points they could find, but sometimes I wonder about all the other hatches that might be out there, hidden under years of fallen leaves. And I think about whoever was down there, watching campers through the trees, collecting photos of people who never knew they were being observed. I haven't been camping since. My sister Rachel and I have been hiking together since we were teenagers. We do at least 3 major trails every year, always in different locations. Last April, we decided to tackle a section of the Pacific Crest Trail in Northern California. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the week, perfect for our planned 5-day trek. We'd done longer hikes before, but something about this one felt different from the start. The trail was surprisingly empty for that time of year. We'd been hiking for about 6 hours on our second day when we came across the first campsite. Everything looked perfectly normal at first glance. A high-end 4-season tent, top-of-the-line camping gear spread around the site, a metal bear canister full of food. But something felt off. The tent door was wide open, flapping slightly in the breeze. An expensive DSLR camera sat unprotected on a rock, morning dew coating its lens. A satellite phone and GPS unit lay on a camping table, along with a MacBook Air and a wallet full of credit cards. Rachel approached the camping table while I checked the tent. A metal camping mug still had coffee in it, grounds settled at the bottom. Next to it was a protein bar with only 1 bite taken out of it. A leather-bound journal lay open, the pen still resting in its spine. The last entry was from the previous morning. Day 4, beautiful sunrise this morning. Planning to reach Chester by tomorrow afternoon. Strange sounds last night, probably just deer. The handwriting was neat and unhurried. Inside the tent, everything was meticulously organized. 2 sleeping bags were laid out, unzipped but otherwise undisturbed. A pair of hiking boots sat by the entrance, socks tucked neatly inside. 2 backpacks were propped against the far wall, still packed. Rachel called out to me. She'd found a phone on the table, its battery still at 82%. The last text message was sent the previous evening. Made camp for the night. All good here. Signal's weak but should be better tomorrow. There were 3 missed calls from someone named Mom from earlier that morning. We spent the next hour searching the surrounding area and calling out. The campsite was near a trail intersection with paths leading in 3 directions. We found no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing, nothing to indicate anything violent had happened. It was as if the campers had simply vanished in the middle of their morning routine. Rachel used the satellite phone to call the ranger station. They said they'd send someone immediately and asked us to stay put. 2 rangers arrived about an hour later. They documented everything, took photos, and checked the IDs in the wallet. The campers were identified as Michael and Sarah Chen, siblings from Seattle on a week-long hiking trip. The rangers were particularly interested in the journal entries. While they were thorough in their investigation, I could tell by their expressions that something wasn't adding up. One of them mentioned that this was the 3rd abandoned campsite they'd found in the area over the past 2 years. We ended up staying at the ranger station that night as more search teams arrived. By evening, there were over 20 people combing the area. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew overhead. Search dogs sniffed the camp but lost the scent after following it about 50 yards into the woods. The Chen family arrived late that night, their faces drawn with worry. Their mother showed us recent photos of Michael and Sarah, both avid hikers in their early 30s who'd been doing trails like this for years. Over the next few days, we learned more about the other disappearances. 2 years ago, a solo hiker named James Martinez left behind a similar scene. Expensive gear untouched, breakfast half-eaten, no signs of struggle. 8 months later, a couple named Thomas and Emily Wright vanished from their campsite, leaving behind their wedding rings and all their equipment. Like the Chens, they were experienced hikers who knew the area well. None of them were ever found. The search for the Chens continued for weeks. Rachel and I stayed in the area for several days, helping where we could. The rangers mapped out every possible route they might have taken, searched every cave and ravine within miles. They found nothing. No clothing, no equipment, no remains. The only odd detail came from another hiker who'd passed their campsite the evening before they vanished. He reported seeing strange lights in the woods, which he'd assumed were other campers. He said the lights seemed to move in unusual patterns, but he'd been too far away to make out anything clearly. 6 months later, I attended a meeting with the families of all the missing hikers. The police had officially classified the cases as cold. They'd analyzed the Chens' camera and found photos from their first 3 days. Normal hiking shots, landscapes, selfies at lookout points. The last photo was taken the evening before they vanished, a beautiful sunset over the mountains. Their bank accounts remained untouched, their social media inactive. The other missing hikers' cases were similarly devoid of clues. All their possessions were eventually placed in storage at the ranger station, waiting for answers that never came. Rachel and I still go hiking, but things are different now. We carry a personal locator beacon and check in with family multiple times a day. We never camp near that section of the PCT, though I've spent countless hours studying maps of the area, trying to make sense of what happened. Sometimes I think about that journal entry. Strange sounds last night, probably just deer. I wonder what Michael Chen really heard in the darkness, what made him and his sister leave all their possessions behind and walk into the woods, never to be seen again. But mostly, I think about those lights the hiker saw, moving in patterns that didn't make sense, and I wonder what they might have been following. Wintertime camping has always been our family tradition. My wife Sarah and I started taking our kids winter camping when they were young, teaching them about cold weather survival and the beauty of nature in its most serene state. We'd done it every year for the past decade without incident. This January, we decided to try a new spot in the Adirondacks, about 4 hours from our home in Connecticut. The forecast showed light snow and temperatures around 20 degrees Fahrenheit, perfect conditions for the insulated tent and gear we'd invested in over the years. We arrived at the campsite around noon on Saturday. The snow was about 8 inches deep, pristine and untouched. Our kids, Emma and Tyler, 14 and 12, helped us set up our large four-season tent, while Sarah organized the cooking gear on the snow-covered picnic table. The site was perfect. A small clearing surrounded by dense pine trees, with a view of the mountains in the distance. The only sounds were the occasional creaking of snow-laden branches and the soft patter of fresh snowflakes hitting our jackets. By dusk, we had everything set up and were enjoying hot chocolate and beef stew cooked on our camping stove. The temperature was dropping, but our gear kept us warm. We sat around the lantern telling stories and playing cards until about 8 p.m. The kids were getting tired from the day's activities, and the cold has a way of making you sleepy. Before turning in, I walked the perimeter of our camp, checking our food storage and making sure everything was secure. The snow had stopped falling, leaving an ethereal stillness in the air. Inside the tent, we had a good setup. 4 sleeping bags rated for sub-zero temperatures arranged on insulated pads, with a small battery-powered heater providing just enough warmth to take the edge off. Emma read her book by lantern light while Tyler played games on his tablet. Sarah was already dozing off. I remember checking my watch, 9:17 p.m., before turning off the lantern. The absolute darkness of a winter night in the wilderness enveloped us. I woke up several times during the night, which isn't unusual when winter camping. Each time, I heard nothing but the wind and the occasional crack of a branch under its snow load. Around what I guess was 2 a.m., I thought I heard something that sounded like soft footsteps in snow, but when I listened more carefully, there was only silence. The kids slept soundly, and Sarah hadn't stirred. I dozed off again, chalking it up to the usual nighttime forest sounds. The next morning, I unzipped the tent to check the weather and stopped cold. There were footprints in the snow around our tent, but not normal footprints. These were perfect circles, each exactly the same size, pressed deep into the snow. They formed a complete circle around our tent, spaced precisely 2 feet apart. The tracks started at the edge of our campsite and completed a full circuit around our tent before returning to their starting point. From the depth and clarity of the impressions, whoever made them had stood in each spot for a considerable time. I quickly zipped the tent closed and woke Sarah, showing her pictures I'd taken on my phone. She went pale. We decided not to tell the kids yet, but we needed to pack up and leave immediately. As we started gathering our things, we found other disturbing signs. Some of our gear had been moved, not stolen, just rearranged. A flashlight we'd left on the picnic table was now hanging from a tree branch. Our boots, which we'd left neatly by the tent entrance, were placed in a perfect line leading toward the woods. The kids noticed something was wrong when we rushed them through breakfast, but we managed to keep them calm. As we packed up the site, I followed the strange circular footprints to where they entered the woods. They continued in a straight line between the trees, each step exactly 2 feet apart, never deviating or changing pace. They disappeared into the morning fog about 50 yards in. The precision was unnatural. No human could maintain such perfect spacing while walking through snow-covered forest at night. We reported the incident to the park rangers before leaving. They seemed unusually interested in the circular footprints, asking specific questions about their size and spacing. One ranger pulled out a file and showed us photos from 2 other incidents in the past month. Identical circular footprints found around campsites, always forming a complete circle, always perfectly spaced. In one case, the campers had slept through the night undisturbed. In the other, they'd been woken by what they described as a tall, dark shape standing motionless at the edge of their campsite. The rangers took detailed measurements and photos of the prints. Each circle was exactly 11.5 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. The spacing between each print was exactly 24 inches, measured center to center. They made plaster casts and collected snow samples from inside the impressions. The ranger mentioned they'd sent previous samples to a lab for analysis. The results showed high levels of an unidentified chemical compound in the snow where the prints were, but nowhere else in the surrounding area. On the drive home, Emma finally asked why we'd left so quickly. We told them a simplified version, that we'd found evidence someone had been walking around our campsite at night and decided it was safer to leave. That night, after the kids were asleep, Sarah and I looked through the photos again. In one of them, barely visible in the background, there was something we hadn't noticed at the campsite. A set of fresh circular prints in the snow, leading away from our tent, made after I'd taken the first photos. Whatever had stood watching us all night had returned while we were packing up.